Hello everyone, Prime here, hope you've had a great day, and today we're going to be talking about which pantheon would come out on top between the Slavic and Voodoo pantheons. So first we're going to talk about the warriors of both pantheons, and then we're going to be talking about the gods of both pantheons. Now if you're wondering why the warriors of these different pantheons might be relevant, just consider them to be what the potential minions of each pantheon could be like. First up we have the Slavic warriors and their weapons. Now, typically on the battlefield, Slavic warriors would use spears, axes, slings, bows, and of course shields. Their bows typically used arrows with 3 blades over double-bladed arrows. They were a bit heavier than double-bladed arrows and took up more space in the quiver, which meant that less triple-headed arrows could be taken with them on the battlefield. However, these arrows could penetrate a target a lot better than the double-bladed arrowheads. More penetration power, of course, means a larger hole in the enemy, which of course means more damage, more bleeding, and more pain. And, as I said, they used shields, typically small shields, as the Slavics weren't ones to use armor, they favored maneuverability. Now we're going to move on to the Voodoo warriors, and they also use shields. Their shields were a bit larger and made from animal hide such as hippos. Now aside from the materials that we used, and of course the size differences between these shields, Voodoo warriors took a lot greater pride in their shields, and it was a very important aspect of that warrior's status. Young men could only cover their shields in the colors black, white, and grey, whereas more experienced Voodoo warriors and older warriors could dabble in a few more colors on their shields, showing a bit more status and flair and just importance. Like the Slavic warriors, they also wore no armor. So yes, because of the no armor thing, the shields were highly valued. So much so that kings started to enforce punishments, or may even look down upon certain warriors who ended up losing their shields on the battlefield, or returned from the battlefield without their shields. The spear was also a favored weapon among the Voodoo people. It featured a long wooden pole and a metallic sharp edge. So of course the spear was a very nice piercing weapon. They also used special clubs fashioned from wood, and specifically they would take the barks of trees, which were typically the hardest parts, to make the actual hitting portion of the club. And they would throw these clubs to disable animals for hunting, or they would use them to bash human opponents with in combat. And as you might be able to tell, if you're put out of action by one of these things, you're not going to be getting up anytime soon. To protect higher status people, the Voodoo warriors that functioned as bodyguards might have also equipped daggers or perhaps variations of swords. Typically it seems that spears and shields were usually the way to go among the Voodoo warriors, from what I found at least. Now moving on to the tactics and strategies of the different armies. So, because of the lack of armor, Slavic units were known to be nimble, using ambushes and guerrilla warfare to their advantage. So because they typically used these types of strategies, their armies weren't necessarily massive hordes of men. They favored smaller units and armies like that. But still, they were successful in taking fortified cities with sieges, and their armies consisted of cavalry, foot soldiers, and archers. And so whilst the Slavics didn't usually necessarily employ fear tactics, cavalry in and of themselves can be quite a fearsome thing to face if you've only got foot soldiers. As well as that, cavalry can be used to quickly reinforce another position, and it's much easier to retreat with cavalry units than it would be to retreat with foot soldiers. And that's just down to the fact that on horseback, someone would of course have greater speed and mobility than someone who's not on horseback. Now, much like the Slavic warriors, Voodoo warriors, of course, thanks to the fact that they didn't wear armor, were a lot more maneuverable than combatants that would have been wearing armor. Voodoo warriors were very successful with ambushing tactics, but were no strangers to using fear tactics as well. So they would knock their spears against their shields and make very specific war cries and scary noises to, of course, scare and terrify their enemies. After all, if you disorientate and shake your enemies a bit, it's easier to fight a shaken force than a sturdy force. And of course, voodoo warriors were no strangers to using large numbers of men in their armies, as opposed to Slavic warriors. So as for the question of which army comes out on top, as you can tell, both armies were quite similar. They both, of course, made up for their lack of armor with shields, which allowed them to maintain their mobility. They both used similar types of tactics, being ambushing tactics and guerrilla warfare. Now, one problem with this sort of matchup is the fact that because these armies are so different and they fought in very different environments, depending on what environment they could be fighting on, one side could have a significant disadvantage as opposed to the other. For example, if the fight was to take place in a really cold environment, well, the Slavics would have a massive advantage, as voodoo warriors would have little to no experience fighting in such conditions. But of course, if you had extremely warm climates, such as a desert, as the actual combat area, then of course the voodoo warriors then have a massive advantage. The environment is a tricky factor that I'm going to step away from just to try and simplify things here a little bit. Slavic warriors seem like they take the day. They just have versatility on their side. A single Slavic warrior could have a bow, an axe, a spear, a sling, and a shield with him on the battlefield, versus the more specialized usage of just having a shield and a spear, and maybe also a club with you. The Slavics also had the advantage of using cavalry in their armies, which means that they could react to certain situations on the battlefield a bit better, and employ tactics a little more smoothly or just swiftly than voodoo warriors could. If some of your warriors need reinforcements, and you have cavalry that could quickly gallop over to a location and help out your allies, that's more useful to your allies than foot soldiers trying to run to that location and perhaps getting there too late. And of course, you also have an issue of the voodoo soldiers perhaps getting to a specific location to try and reinforce their troops too late and then not being able to retreat back to a better location. So there's, of course, that level of versatility that cavalry has. And then, of course, when you consider the differences in arrows that both sides and the bowmans were using, and the fact that the Slavic ones just have a better chance of causing more damage, because, to be honest, if either arrow is going to hit either side, because none of them's really got that much more protection than a shield, if it hits anything other than a shield, it's going to cause a lot of damage either way, but the Slavic arrow will cause more damage and has a greater chance to hit something like a vital organ than a voodoo arrow. So even though, yes, a voodoo archer does have less arrows, his arrows are going to pack more of a punch. And in my opinion, because we're comparing the standard archers, that makes the Slavic archer better than the voodoo archer. Moving on to the gods. Again, we're going to start off with the Slavic gods. And first up, we're going to have the Slavic god of thunder and lightning, Perun. He was a patron of fire, mountains, horses, weapons, and war, as well as, of course, thunder and lightning. The god of thunder rode around in a flaming chariot driven by goats, and he was the representation of order in Slavic mythology. He also came into battle equipped with an axe, kind of similar to how Thor came into battle with the hammer Mjolnir, and when Perun threw the axe, it would always return to his hand, apparently. Now, Perun did indeed have a nemesis, and his nemesis was considered to be the god of the underworld, Veles, or Veles, or... He was considered to be a patron of animals, but this varies depending on where in exactly Slavic mythology you're getting this information from. Some people in Slavic mythology believed he was the patron of bears, and he could transform into bears, and he protected bears. Others believed that he protected wolves, he was the patron of wolves, and he transformed into wolves. Others believed that he was the patron of sheep. He transformed into... Okay, he didn't necessarily transform into a sheep, but he protected sheep, a bit like a shepherd. But the most notable form of Velen, outside of his more, human-looking appearance, was in fact a serpent or dragon appearance. And this is drawing a lot of similarities between Baltaic and Norse mythology. Veles was said to roam around the bottom of this very important tree in Slavic mythology, and eventually Veles takes a step too far because he's considered to be the representation of chaos in Slavic mythology, and he takes this a bit too far when he kidnaps the wife and children of Perun, causing Perun to chase after him. And Veles runs so far that eventually he is caught by the Thunder God and they do battle and Perun is defeated. Now, either Perun is slain, which is quite unfortunate for Perun, or he is chased or sent right back into the underworld and pretty much remains there. Now, if he's slain, he eventually does come back. I don't know too much about the details of his resurrection or his return, but he doesn't stay dead permanently. That's the main part. Next up, the last god we're going to be talking about is Koshneche. Koshneche? He was notably skinny and a god of death and a frost sorcerer. He could turn people into walnuts in some stories, and in others, he could turn an entire kingdom into stone. So he was quite the mischievous chap, and he would try to seduce significantly younger women into being into some sort of relationship with him or something along those lines. And when those young women inevitably did reject him because he was significantly older than them, he would turn them into toads and other animals or creatures. He also constantly claimed to be immortal, which is fairly, it's a thing with him. He did that a lot. So there's that. Moving on to voodoo gods, we have the wife of Baron Saturday, Oya. O-Y-A is how it's spelled here, but yeah. Mother of 9 children. She resided over winds, hurricanes, death, and tempests, among a few other things, and lived at the gate of the graveyard. She was the ruler of the realm of the dead along with her husband, and she used either a machete or sword to change dying wood into new forms of like trees and plant life, things like that. She's credited with creating the Niger River, which is about 2,600 miles long and 50 meters deep. The depth of the actual river itself varies depending on where in the river you're actually looking at, but she did this using nothing but rainstorms, which is quite impressive. So she's definitely one of the stronger deities and stronger voodoo spirits as well. So there's that. Last thing, she possessed the ability to transform into hurricanes or tempests, and her patron animal being a water buffalo. Next god is Shango. He was an ancient king in his origins with a thunderous voice, and every time he spoke, some flames would spew out of his mouth. Eventually, some time was passing and gradually his followers started to leave him, and he became so depressed over the meager amount of followers that he was eventually seeing himself with that he hung himself. Now, some of his followers saw this as his transformation from a mere king to a god. And they believed that he took on attributes of a previous god called Jakuta. This Jakuta, one of his roles was that he was the wrath of the gods. So they believed that Shango embodied an aspect of this or part of this. Thanks to this, his cult spread and Django became more of an important god within voodoo mythology, and he even took up of being a war deity as well. He controlled the elements of fire and lightning, and he could spawn an axe called the From His Forehead. And when he banged his batter drums, he could summon storms. So another fairly important, powerful deity there for the voodoo gods. Now, the last one I shall mention is arguably the second strongest deity in voodoo mythology. He was a god of wisdom and knowledge and divinity. And he was present during the beginning times, the creation of everything. Now, he didn't actually necessarily help in any of this creating. That was the original first god, the all-powerful god of voodoo mythology. That was all his doing, but because he was overseer of all of this, he was watching as this was happening, he was considered to be the spirit that is second in command. Now, he also, through the power of the Supreme Oracle, he can apparently reveal the future and relay this information to other spirits and, of course, people. In fact, one of his main purposes was that he was supposed to aid humanity as a teacher and bringer of knowledge, and he was training priests in the arts of voodooism. So, fairly important god. I've got a pretty simple decision as to who I think wins out of the gods of Slavic pantheons versus the Voodoo Pantheon, and it essentially comes down to me not being 100% sure as to how the Voodoo Pantheon works, as far as if a lower spirit is to die, does their energy sort of go back to the original creator deity, or are they completely just dead? If they completely just die, well, you still have the issue of the original creative deity pretty much being all-powerful, all-everything, and he's pretty much a massive hurdle, whereas the Slavic pantheon, I get a strong sense of the fact that pretty much every god there, they're not exactly immortal beings, a lot like Norse gods or Mayan gods. So, because of that, I'm not 100% sure that it would be possible to defeat the entire Voodoo Pantheon. However, defeating the individual lower spirits, that would be the battle of the gods in favor of the Slavic Pantheon. However, technically winning, that goes to the Voodoo Pantheon. But, in a nutshell, that's my opinion. Do you agree? Disagree? You think I missed a lot of important points? Small points? Anything? Let me know in the comment section below. But thank you very, very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, go ahead and leave a like. And as always, if you're new to the channel, go ahead and subscribe. There's always room for you. Now, you probably noticed that today's Thursday, and usually I post more videos in a week. But funny how a bunch of different things kept me from posting this week. Hopefully it's just a thing of this week and doesn't continue on to next week, but you'll know pretty soon whether or not it continues on to next week, but I hope it doesn't. But yes, until the next video, have a very good day. I have been Prime, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.